Sparta. The very word of it puts an image in one's mind, one that's captivated imaginations for millennia. The Spartans are often portrayed as single-minded warriors, a society of austere, disciplined and stoic soldiers, utterly devoted to a single purpose, and that purpose is battle. But beyond that, there's a deeper history of Sparta, and it's a lot more complex than the popular myth. The task of separating fact from legend, that's quite a challenge, not least because most surviving accounts were written by non-Spartans, often long after the events described. These ancient sources, from Herodotus and Thucydides all the way to Plutarch and Pausanias, therefore must be read with a rather critical eye. Of course, they're subject to their own criticism from modern scholarship. This modern scholarship in archaeology does also help us to fill in the gaps. But don't be fooled. The story of Sparta is long from being anything but mysterious. All these aspects of Spartan history certainly remain debated. So, today what we are going to do is go through a chronological narrative, the full arc of Spartan history, from those early times of consolidation in Laconia through its territorial expansion and those unique military and social systems that they developed, all the way to its apex of power during the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. And then, of course, we'll get to their decline in the face of Theban and Macedonian ascendance, concluding with its fate under Roman rule. Sorry for the spoiler alert. Well, I think by the end, we'll all have a nuanced picture of what Sparta was really like. Of course, modern scholarship, the wheels of that keep on turning, and this video will perhaps need to be remade in 5 years' time. They're still digging through the dirt, finding out all new little things about the Spartans, such as the ancient world. But we'll piece together what we have, and by the end come out with a picture, the real Sparta, and the people who lived in it. So, let's all get nice and relaxed. You're about to learn something. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. Those who are new, I invite you to hit the subscribe button. Leave your thoughts down in the comments, as it's quite good for the algorithm. And you will notice there is not a single ad in these videos. It's thanks to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who chose to donate. Thank you very much for that. Now, with all that out of the way, like I said, nice and relaxed, and we can begin. So where exactly does Sparta's story begin? Well, we start our journey in the southeastern Peloponnese, in the region known as Laconia. Long before the classical Spartans appeared, the area was home to a Mycenaean Greek civilization. In fact, recent archaeological discoveries do show the vicinity of Sparta was an important center as far back as the 14th century BCE, a late Bronze Age palace complex, and they had brilliant palaces in the Mycenaean tradition. And this palace in particular, likely associated with Homeric Lacedaemon, by the way, it stood near the later city, yielding clay tablets in linear B script and rich frescoes. This linear B script, as well, is yet to be translated, one of those historical mysteries that still remain. Fingers crossed, we will sort that one out soon. Now, this Bronze Age palace was destroyed around 1200 BC, the typical end of the Bronze Age, that great collapse, and Greece entered what was known as a Dark Age. According to later Greek tradition, Sparta's founders were Dorian Greeks, who migrated into the Peloponnese in this post-Mycenaean period, that Dark Age of panic. Herodotus and other ancient authors refer to the Spartans as Dorians and trace their lineage back to the heroic age of Heracles, through the legend of the return of the Heraclidae. In myth, the Heraclid twins, Eurysthenes and Procles, became the first joint kings of Sparta, establishing the unusual dual monarchy that actually persisted throughout Spartan history. And this is also something that you will find in many Greek cultures. This mythical beginnings. We have it with Athens. We have it with Rome. We have it with Carthage as well, if we're going to include them in the broader ancient tapestry. It always comes with a story that treads the line between myth and history. And this is where we must be careful with ancient Greek history, because, well, Herodotus, he treads a very thin line between what is fact and fiction. Well, while it is mythic in terms of this establishment story, the tale does reflect a kernel of truth. The Spartan state always had two equal kings from two lineages, now those lineages being the Argeads and the Eurypontids, a system that is said to originate from the twin founders sanctioned by the Delphic oracle. So whether it was mythic in its beginning or not, the tradition still persisted. So of course, it had to come from somewhere. But if we go into very strict historical terms, it appears that by around the 10th, or perhaps the 9th century BCE, after the upheavals of the Greek Dark Age, a new Spartan community coalesced in the Eurotas River Valley of Laconia. Archaeologists in our modern times note that after 1000 BCE, 4 adjacent villages, those being Pitana, Limnae, Mesua, and Kinosora, gradually merged to form the nucleus of what would become known as Sparta. This process of synoecism, that is the union of villages, it created a single polis of Sparta on the west bank of Eurotas. Now, polis, of course, being the Greek word for city. This is why you hear words like necropolis for a cemetery, city of the dead, Acropolis, all of these other ones, Heliopolis, city of the sun. You'll find this a lot in Greek and Greek colonies. Now, what about this location? Why pick that in particular? Well, it was quite advantageous. You see, Sparta lay in a fertile plain ringed by mountains, and that included the mighty Mount Taygetus to the west. The valley of the Eurotas, ancient hollow Lacedaemon, was well watered, and agriculturally it was quite productive, giving the Spartan settlers a reliable source of food. Now, there is another observation. This access to the abundance of food, it was not something that everybody had. The local rivals did not enjoy such a privilege, and actually even the name Sparta derives from a Greek word meaning to sow, reflecting fertile soil. This agricultural surplus would underpin their growth, and it enabled its citizens to feed themselves, and later, a large, dependent population. Of course, right now we're talking about the Spartans as farmers. This was long before they had developed this unique identity. So we'll get to that. So as Sparta consolidated control over Laconia in this early days of the Iron Age, it absorbed or just subdued neighboring peoples. The Spartans themselves, those descendants of Dorian Greek invaders, at least according to tradition, established a dominant class of citizen warriors in the plain around their city. Indigenous pre-Dorian inhabitants were gradually reduced to a subordinate status. Some became what was known as perioikoi, dwellers around, means in modern English, free residents of surrounding towns. They lacked Spartan citizenship, sure, but managed local affairs and served in the army as light infantry or hoplites. Others were not so lucky, subjugated more harshly. One early target was the Achaean town of Helos on the Laconian coast. The Spartans, quote, laid waste Helos and won a battle against the Argives, who came to aid the Helots. Now, according to later etymology, the inhabitants of Helos were the first to be called Helots. This is a term that came to denote Sparta's unfree class of serfs, basically slaves, forced to work the fields while the Spartans got down to more important things. But whether or not the word truly derives from Helos, that is unclear. But what is clear is that by the 8th century BCE, Sparta had a large population of enslaved agricultural workers, called the Helots, and they were tied to the land. These were primarily Greeks of Laconia who had been conquered. They farmed the estates of Spartan masters and provided food that allowed Spartan citizens to pursue full-time military training. The subjugation of Laconia was essentially complete by the 8th century, giving Sparta a core territory and an exploited workforce that set it apart from many of the other Greek city-states, certainly putting all their skill points into strength, that's for sure. But here's an interesting thing. Early Sparta was not yet the grim military barracks of the later legend. You see, Archaic, or early Sparta, showed considerable cultural creativity and also engagement with the wider Greek world. Archaeological finds and literary fragments suggest that in the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, Sparta participated in the artistic and poetic renaissance that was then sweeping Greece. Do remember that this is the recovery period of the Greek Dark Ages. And of course, after the darkness comes the dawn. Then we get to Spartan pottery, noted for its skilled decoration. It's been found as far afield as Cyrene in Libya and the island of Samos, and that of course indicates that they had an active trade. An ivory carving workshop at the sanctuary of Artemis in Orthia in Sparta produced fine ivory figurines and ornaments all the way up until the 6th century BCE. These delicate ivories depicting animals, human figures, even a stylized tree of life. Well, they reveal that Spartans patronized luxury arts in the periods before their society became, well, intensely martialized. Sparta was also renowned for its poetry and music in the 7th century. Spartan poets like Alcman composed choral hymns of remarkable beauty for festivals, while Tyrtaeus crafted stirring martial elegies that reportedly inspired warriors in battle. Now, it's been observed by one historian, JSTOR, and this is a good observation. I will quote from him. In reality, we have more testimony to poetic activity at Sparta in the 7th century than for any other Greek state, and that includes Athens. Isn't that interesting? That's a striking fact, if any. The city later stereotyped as being culturally barren, at least according to Mr. Starr. Well, it led, at the time, the Greek production of lyric poetry, at least in that period. Some of this early Spartan poetry survives in fragmentary form. We're quite lucky to have that. Tyrtaeus, in particular, gives us a window into the value system emerging in Sparta after its early wars. And we have a famous fragment, one of the more well-known ones, in it Tyrtaeus exhorts young men to stand firm in battle rather than flee. I'll quote it right now. Here is courage, mankind's finest possession. Here is the noblest prize that a young man can endeavor to win. It is a good thing for the city and all the people when a man plants his feet and stands in the foremost spears relentlessly, all thought of foul flight completely forgotten, and has well trained his heart to be steadfast and endure. Now that sounds more like the Spartans we know, don't you think? Lines like those, recited to Spartan citizens in training, they reveal a burgeoning ethos of discipline, endurance, and also heroic self-sacrifice, the exact kind of attributes that would later define Sparta. It's pretty clear, to me at least, that by the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Sparta was transitioning from just another Greek city into a very unique, militarized society. The pressures of war, as we shall see, they were the clear catalyst for this transformation. But before getting into the wars, we have to consider the semi-legendary lawgiver to whom the Spartans themselves ascribed their distinctive system. A name maybe you are familiar with, Lycurgus. Well, just like many other figures of the time, Lycurgus is, well, shrouded in legend and a bit of mystery. The Spartans of later eras believed that a single great reformer by the name of Lycurgus had established their laws and institutions back in those ancient times, perhaps in the 9th or 8th century. But modern scholars, always ruining the fun, well, they doubt that the radical Spartan system was the creation of one man, but likely the Spartan constitution was something that evolved over time. Nevertheless, the Lycurgan tradition is pretty important for understanding how Spartans thought about themselves. According to Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, which was, by the way, written much later, 2nd century CE actually, Lycurgus introduced the Great Retra, an oracle-sanctioned constitution that reorganized every bit of Spartan society. The Retra, as reported by Plutarch, mandated a council of elders, the Gerousia, of about 28 men over 60 years old, plus the 2 kings, periodic assemblies of Spartan citizens, the peers or equals, the homioi, and a strict prohibition on written laws, implying that the law was to be preserved orally and by tradition. Plutarch relates that Lycurgus traveled widely, to Crete, and even as far as Egypt to gather ideas, and then returned to implement these radical reforms. He redistributed the land of Laconia into equal plots, so that every Spartan citizen family had enough to produce and support themselves. He banned gold and silver money, replacing it reportedly with cumbersome iron spits to discourage greed, and instituted common mess halls and rigorous education for the young. Before his death, he is said to have made the Spartans swear to uphold his laws until he returned, and then he deliberately disappeared, in one story starving himself to death, so that the constitution would never be abolished. But how much of that is true? It's pretty impossible to say. Lycurgus may well be a mythical or composite figure, and even Plutarch admitted that different sources gave wildly different stories for him, and even dates ranging over centuries. But let's think about what really matters. What matters is that the Spartans attributed the discipline and stability of their society to the reforms of Lycurgus. As Xenophon had observed, Lycurgus reached the utmost limit of wisdom by devising a constitutional order utterly different from that of other states. So we can now turn to what that order actually was. And this is where we get into the more recognizable Sparta. Perhaps the one you've been looking forward to. Now, it only took 20 minutes to get here. Not too bad. Well, especially how it was developing in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. This was the time where Sparta was going through its territorial expansion. So let's turn to that next. By the latter 8th century, Sparta had already emerged as the preeminent power in southern Greece. Laconia was completely under its boot, and the Spartans looked west to the fertile neighboring region of Messene. The desire for land and resources, perhaps driven by the population growth among the Spartan citizenry, led to a series of brutal conflicts known as the Messenian Wars. These wars would prove formative for Spartan society, forcing the city-state to become a more militarized camp and suppress a growing subject population. They also likely accelerated the implementation of the Lycurgan system of training and governance, as only a radical disciplined society could hold down the masses of conquered Messenians. So, the First Messenian War broke out around the late 8th century BC. Traditional dates often give it as 743 to 724, though ancient sources do differ. But according to Pausanias, who preserves accounts from both sides, which is rare in itself, the causes of the war were disputed. The Spartans, they told one version, the Messenians told another. All a bit confusing. But what is clear is that Sparta invaded Messenia with the intent to conquer. It was back in those days where you didn't really need to come up with a justification for war. You didn't need to have some false flag on a naval ship or some incident to provoke it. It was enough to just show up and say, yeah, we just want to take over. We want your land. We want your gold. That was the only justification you needed. Well, it wasn't the best of manners, I suppose, but war never is. So Sparta invaded Messenia with that pure intent to conquer. The war lasted perhaps 2 decades, indicated fierce resistance by the Messenians, who defended their mountain fortresses. Early in the war, the Spartan king leading the campaign was Theopompus of the Eurypontid line, while the Argead king Polydorus, reputed for his just and popular character, was also prominent. Eventually, the Spartans prevailed. The stronghold of Ithome fell, and by around 720, Messenia was subjugated. Pausanias writes that after this first war, Messenians were enslaved to the Lacedaemonians. The native Messenians were reduced to the status of helots, just like the earlier Laconian helots were, effectively state-owned serfs, forced to turn over the bulk of their agricultural produce to their Spartan overlords. And good luck fighting against that system, when your overlords literally trained for combat in every aspect of their life. The acquisition of an entire people as helot laborers was a watershed in Spartan history. Overnight, the tiny Spartan citizenry found itself ruling over a vast, potentially restive population of slaves. The resources of Messenia roughly doubled Sparta's territory, and likely made the Spartans among the wealthiest Greeks in terms of land per citizens. But this wealth, it came with a peril. You see, the helots, they now vastly outnumbered the Spartans, by some estimates 7 to 1 or even more, and they would always be a threat to rebellion. Indeed, controlling Messenia and its helots became the central obsession of Spartan policy for the next 3 centuries. and it was in response to this challenge, according to many scholars, that the full vigor of the Lycurgan military social system was finally enforced. The Spartans essentially transformed themselves into a permanent, occupying army, living in constant readiness to crush any slave uprising. The social engineering that Lycurgus, real or not, is credited with, took its mature form in the 7th to 6th centuries. The hallmarks of classical Spartan society, they all tie back to the need for internal cohesion and military preparedness in the face of the Helot threat. So let's talk about a few of those key systems. The first was the agōgē, education and training. Spartan boys, they were famously taken from their families at the age of 7 to enter the agōgē, a famous state-sponsored education system in toughness, obedience, and eventually combat. They lived in a barracks under the supervision of older youths and officials. Xenophon marvels that in Sparta, the citizens pay the strictest obedience to the magistrates and laws, and notes that Lycurgus's institutions trained them from childhood for this. Boys went barefoot, wore minimal clothing, even in winter, and were intentionally underfed, forced to steal to survive, which trained them in stealth. Now, if you got caught stealing, they were whipped, but not for the theft. Theft was acceptable. What was not acceptable was being caught. That was a failure. Your skills were not good enough. And there's an old story, too, that's pretty emblematic of the Spartan ethos. The legend goes that a Spartan boy once stole a fox cub to eat. When confronted by an adult, he hid the fox beneath his tunic. Well, the fox was not quite happy with going along with the plan of being eaten, and he proceeded to tear out the boy's insides with his claws. But, being so disciplined, the youth did not make a single sound, and he just allowed it to happen. He'd rather die than betray his theft. Pretty interesting, don't you think? But it might raise a bit of an eyebrow. Stories like that, though possibly completely made up, they were told even by later writers like Plutarch, and were given quite a bit of credence too, because they were in accordance with the very real situation of Sparta, that endurance that the youths displayed. In fact, Plutarch himself claims to have seen Spartan boys flogged to death without making a single sound at the altar of Artemis or Thea. Through songs, contests, harsh mentorship, the agōgē produced young men conditioned to obey orders absolutely, endure pain and hardship, and value the group over themselves. Ideal soldiers, and of course, ideal oppressors of the Helots. Let's move now to the Syssitia, the system of communal brotherhood. Adult Spartan men, upon reaching the age of 20, would join a Syssition, a dining mess group of about 15 members. Membership in a Syssition and continued contribution of one's share of food from your estate was required to attain and keep full citizenship. The Syssitia were at the heart of Spartan equality. Rich or poor, they all ate the same simple fare, that notorious black broth of blood and vinegar, amongst a few other staples. But above all, it all reminded them that they lived together as soldiers. According to Xenophon, Lycurgus had observed that other Greeks lived at home and indulged in luxury, so he established the public messes out in the open, believing that this would minimize disobedience and extravagance. Men ate together daily, They bonded by shared experience. No one was allowed to dine at home in private, and this fostered a strong camaraderie, also allowing peer surveillance, and any sign of disloyalty or discontent would be quickly noticed in the close quarters of communal life. The Syssitios, or mixed ages. Older men sat and spoke with younger, so that, as Xenophon says, the experience of the elders might contribute largely to the education of the juniors. It was in this constant socialization as a single warrior community that helped make Spartan a famously cohesive army in battle. Well, let's talk about economic equality now. Land, property regulations, all the fun stuff. To support the citizen core, Sparta's territory, including Messania, was divided into allotments called klaroi, farmed by the helots. Each citizen theoretically received a portion sufficient to feed himself and his messmates. Plutarch relates that Lycurgus originally made some 9,000 equal land lots for the Spartans. Now, believe it or not, people in ancient times actually owned land and their own homes. We are getting into mythological territory, aren't we? Well, over time, however, this ideal eroded. By Aristotle's day, that is the 4th century BCE, land had accumulated in the hands of a few, and many Spartans were dispossessed. Aristotle criticizes this, noting pointedly that in Sparta of his time, nearly 2/5 of the whole area is owned by women due to inheritances and land that had fallen into a few hands. But you see, during the height of Sparta's power, the 6th and 5th centuries, citizens did largely enjoy a frugal equality, and personal wealth was something that was quite frowned upon. Gold and silver coinage, as we've mentioned, were banned in favor of those iron spits of impractical weight, and no one wants to collect too many of them. Trade and craft, they were left to the perioikoi and foreigners. Spartan citizens were forbidden from manual labor or business, dedicating themselves solely to arms. This was an unusual economic model, even in Greece. Essentially a proud aristocratic communism, but sustained on the backs of an enslaved underclass, which is a very strange kind of communism. But it's kind of like that in a sense. At the top, there was this sense of it among themselves, but exploitation of the working class. That's why we put it in this terms of aristocratic communism and not proletariat communism. Oh boy, we're not going to go too deep into that, aren't we? That's a topic for another video. Well, speaking of the government, the Spartan government, mixed monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy in a way that impressed even philosophers like Plato. And he's pretty difficult to impress, by the way. The 2 hereditary kings, one from each royal house, served as generals-in-chief and high priests. But their power was checked by other institutions. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, comprised of 28 senior nobles, over 60 years old, elected for life, by the way, plus 2 kings, making 30 members. This council prepared legislation and served as a supreme court. The Appella, the assembly of all male Spartan citizens over 30, met periodically to vote by acclamation on proposals. In theory, the people's voice, though without the freewheeling debate of an Athenian-style assembly. Uniquely, Sparta also developed the institution of ephors, or overseers, 5 officials elected annually from the citizen body. The ephors had wide executive powers, able to supervise the kings, enforce discipline, and even prosecute or depose a king if he violated the laws. Every month, kings swore to uphold the laws, and ephors swore on behalf of the city to maintain king's authority, as long as they did so. This elaborate system provided quite a bit of stability. You see, Sparta had no recorded tyrannies or civil strife during its centuries under the Lycurgan order, probably because everybody was too afraid to. But hey, you gotta get the peace somehow, I suppose. Well, Aristotle, while critical of some aspects, he also had to acknowledge the stability of the Spartan constitution, even if, well, the ends perhaps don't justify the means. But he did, however, fault certain inequalities, like the aforementioned land concentration and the liberties of women, which he believed contributed to Sparta's later decline. In practice, at Sparta's peak, the state was managed by a small group of elite families, those producing the Gerousia members and often the ephors, but united by common values and the constant oversight of everyone by everyone else. It was a tightly controlled ship of state, all focused on the primary goal, maintaining dominance over the helots and security against external foes. But what about the other half of the population, the role of women? We should probably talk about that. Now, Spartan women, they enjoyed a reputation for freedom and boldness. This was unlike the other city-states in Greece. From the Lycurgan viewpoint, this too had a military purpose. You see, women were expected to bear healthy children and to reinforce Spartan values in the home. Lycurgus, according to Plutarch and Xenophon, instituted physical training for girls no less than boys, believing strong mothers would produce strong sons. Makes sense, I suppose. Girls participated in running, wrestling, and javelin throwing, and competed in their own festivals. They didn't live in barracks like the men, but Spartan women were relatively liberated in dress and movement. They were famous for their razor-sharp and frank speech. Many pithy sayings of Spartan women actually survive, usually encouraging their men for bravery. For example, I know you've heard it, but just for those who haven't, that famous apocryphal command of the Spartan mother for her son to return from battle with his shield or on it, i.e., victorious or dead. Because men often died in war or spent long years in barracks, women also came to control considerable property by inheritance, as we mentioned. As Aristotle reports with disapproval, by the latter classical period, Spartan women actually owned 40% of the land. And, of course, this gave them great economic influence. Aristotle, well, he blames Sparta's decline in part on the license of its women. This may be an exaggeration, perhaps colored by his own biases. But it is true that in Sparta, unlike Athens, women could own and bequeath property and were not sequestered. Well, they were expected to be partners as well in fostering Spartan values. Foreigners were often shocked by the outspoken, physically robust Spartan woman, but their unique position was integral to the Spartan system's functioning, while the men were perpetually preoccupied with killing as many people as possible in wars. So, having described the distinctive features of Sparta's social and military organization, let's get to the chronological narrative again, as I want to stick to that throughout this talk. I hope you're having fun, by the way. We're only 40 minutes in. We're going to keep going, all right? So let's get to the 7th century BCE. This was a time where Sparta had faced new challenges, and those challenges would test the entrenched system. Not long after the first subjugation of Messenia, the Spartans had to confront a renewed revolt by them, the so-called Second Messenian War, perhaps circa 650. Dates vary. Well, this war erupted when the helots of Messenia seized an opportunity to rebel. Classical sources mention a charismatic Messenian leader, Aristomenes, who led the resistance and became kind of a folk hero for the Messenians. The war was difficult for Sparta. At one point the Spartans were reportedly so hard-pressed they obtained a new war anthem from the poet Tyrtaeus to inspire their troops. Tyrtaeus' poetry indeed paints the ordeal in pretty stark terms, praising those who stand and fight and heaping shame on anyone who would quit the ranks and flee, calling such cowardice the worst disgrace. Eventually, after years of hard fighting, Sparta eventually got the upper hand. The rebellion was crushed. By the time of King Alexander in the early 6th century, Pausanias says, the Messenians revolted, but at last they were overcome and retired from the Peloponnese under a truce. The remnant left behind in the land became the slaves of the Lacedaemonians. Thus, the Second War ended with some Messenians fleeing into exile. Those who remained, well, straight back to the fields. Bad luck. Better luck next time. All of this culminated in Sparta emerging as the unchallenged master of the southern Peloponnese. The dual conquest of Laconia and Messenia meant that by around 600 Sparta controlled territory and resources unmatched by any other Greek city-state. At the same time, these conquests locked Sparta into a rather rigid militaristic posture. The memory of the near defeat in the Second Messenian War, it likely only stiffened the Spartan resolve to never allow a rebellion to come so close to succeeding again. The full institutionalization of the agōgē and other Lycurgan practices may date from this period as a response to that internal threat. Sparta essentially became a proto-garrison state, a society that was perpetually on guard. Well, it was pretty hard to ignore them. Sparta's neighbors took notice of its rising power and, peculiar institutions. In the 6th century BCE, Sparta generally avoided the tyrannies and civil strife that plagued the other Greek city-states. Athens, for example, went through lawgiver crises and tyrants in the 7th and 6th centuries. The stability of Sparta under its reputed Lycurgan systems made it quite influential. Many Greek city-states sent delegations to observe Spartan laws, or sought Spartan arbitration in their disputes, and thus their prestige grew accordingly. However, not all interaction was peaceful. Sparta also began to assert itself in interstate politics, using both war and diplomacy to build a network of alliances. But there was one major rival that remained within the Peloponnese: Argos, a powerful city to the north of Laconia. You see, Argos had early on been a pretty dominant force in the region. The Argives famously defeated Sparta at the Battle of Hysae at around 669, showing that the Spartans could indeed be defeated. In the mid-6th century, conflict between Sparta and Argos reignited. A legendary encounter known as the Battle of the Champions in 546 is recounted by Herodotus. To avoid a full battle, each side agreed to pit 300 chosen champions against each other. After a ferocious fight, only 2 Argives and 1 Spartan were left alive. The Spartan left alive was called Orthriades, by the way. The Argives, thinking they'd won, left the field. But the lone Spartan remained, and he claimed victory. The Argive army subsequently retreated, ceding that Theriatis, a border district, was now a part of Spartan territory. Now this story, though possibly embellished, it shows the transfer of regional hegemony from Argos to Sparta. After mid-6th century, Argos went into decline. Sparta now stood without peer in the Peloponnese. But their expansion was not primarily achieved by colonization or distant conquest, in contrast to other Greek states which founded colonies across the Mediterranean in this era. The one notable overseas colony associated with Sparta was Taras, or Tarentum, in southern Italy, traditionally founded by Spartan illegitimate or lower status offspring called Parthenai, around 706. But generally, instead of sending out colonies, Sparta focused on dominating its immediate vicinity. By about 550, Sparta had formed a network of alliances known as the Peloponnesian League. Though modern historians call it that, the ancient term might simply just be the Lacedaemonians and their allies, something boring like that. I suppose all the creative poets were in Athens, I suppose. Well, this league was less formal than later leagues, but essentially Sparta entered bilateral treaties with states like Tegea, Elis, Megara, and Corinth, and a few more, agreeing to mutual support. Tegea, in Arcadia, to Sparta's north, had long resisted Spartan attack. Herodotus recounts how for years Sparta had fought Tegea unsuccessfully, until an oracle directed the Spartans to steal the bones of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, which was supposedly buried in Tegea itself. After accomplishing this pretty morbid mission, I suppose, through a stratagem of a Spartan named Lycurgan, guess what? The Spartans finally defeated Tegea. Though I suppose the oracle was right all along. But here's an interesting thing. Sparta did not enslave Tegea. Neither did they annex it. Instead, they offered the Tegeans a respectful alliance. And this set a pattern. You see, Sparta preferred to have loyal allies, rather than outright conquered subjects, at least outside of Laconia and Messenia. The Peloponnesian League was a hegemonic alliance where Sparta was the hegemon, that is, the leader, and other states followed Sparta's lead in foreign policy, while generally keeping autonomy in local affairs. The League's oath-bound allies to have some friends and enemies, and to follow Spartans wherever they lead, as recorded by later sources. By 500 BCE, most of the Peloponnese was either allied with or obedient to Sparta, with Argos being the notable holdout. This league would later prove crucial in the wars against both Persia and Athens, and we'll get to them. So here we are, on the eve of the classical era. I know it took a long time to get here, but hey, you signed up for a long video, so there we go. So in this classical era, Sparta had engineered a uniquely stratified society in a dominant position in Greece. But the world was about to change. The city's citizens were a select fraternity of equals, hardened from training of childhood agōgēs and living under a rigid code of martial law and communal loyalty. They prided themselves on their Laconian way of life. Simple, laconic, brief in speech, that's where we get the word from, by the way. Austere and brave. Their kings and generals were respected, if sometimes feared, by other Greeks, and even foreign powers had heard of Spartan prowess. Yet, as Thucydides shrewdly observed, Sparta's greatness was oddly invisible to the eye. Quote, suppose, for example, that the city of Sparta were to become deserted, and only the temples and foundations remained. Future generations would hardly believe that such a simple, unadorned settlement was the seat of the most powerful Greek state. The true strength of Sparta lay not in marble monuments, but in the disciplined bodies and minds of its people. It was this strength that would be tested to the utmost when the Persians invaded Greece. So by the dawn of the 5th century, Sparta was acknowledged as the leading land power in Greece. Now remember, we say land power because naval powers were a little bit different. And if you're familiar with a map of Greece, you'll know why being a naval power is kind of important. Now, this preeminence that Sparta had was soon put to test in a pretty epic confrontation with the Persians, struggle posterity knows as the Greco-Persian Wars. Well, between 490 and 479 BC, Sparta would earn eternal fame for heroism, particularly in the stand of King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. In the aftermath of the victory, however, there were new rivalries emerging, most importantly with Sparta's erstwhile ally Athens. The half-century after the Persian Wars saw the Greek world polarize into two blocks, Sparta and its Peloponnesian League versus Athens and its maritime Delian League. Tensions between the two superpowers led to the catastrophic Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404, which marked both the zenith of Spartan power. In victory, Sparta briefly dominated all Greece, but also the seeds of its eventual decline. So here we go, on to the Persian Wars. Sparta had only sporadic contact with lands beyond Greece before the 5th century, but when the mighty Persian Empire expanded into Ionia, that is the Greek cities of Asia Minor, in the late 6th century, Greek states were drawn into a wider geopolitical conflict. In 499, the Ionian Greeks rebelled against the Persian rule and appealed to their mainland kin for help. After all, we're all Greeks, aren't we? A delegation from Athens and the Ionian city of Eretria actually sailed to Anatolia and helped burn the Persian regional capital Sardis. According to Herodotus, the Ionians also asked Sparta for aid. The Spartan king, Cleomenes I, famously refused after being told that Susa, the Persian royal city, lay a 3-month journey inland. The prospect of marching such a distance, it's a little bit of a bridge too far, I'm afraid. Thus Sparta stayed out of the Ionian revolt, which the Persians crushed by 494. But there was a problem. The Persian king, Darius, was now aware of Athens and Eretria's meddling, and he was not impressed. He resolved to punish those Greek upstarts by invasion. In 490 BC, a Persian task force crossed the Aegean. The Spartans were not the ones who met this invasion, by the way. That honor and perhaps burden fell to the Athenians. And so when the Persian army landed at Marathon in Attica, Athens faced them with essentially, no allies. Only a small contingent from Plataea had joined them, but it didn't really count for much. But you'd be surprised. The Athenians won a stunning victory at the famous Battle of Marathon, defeating the Persians and forcing their withdrawal. Herodotus notes that the Spartans had promised to assist Athens. They arrived, but too late. Delayed because they would not march before the full moon due to a religious festival. The Carnea, by the way. 2 days after Marathon, 2,000 Spartan hoplites showed up, toured the battlefield to see the Persian dead, and congratulated the Athenians on their success. This episode, though a bit of a footnote, is quite telling. It shows Sparta's piety. You don't hear about that too much, don't you? Religious observance took precedence over immediate military aid. But it also showed a certain isolationism. In 490, Sparta seemed content to defend the Peloponnese and leave the distant Athens to fend for itself. But a decade later, a far greater Persian invasion force went to Sparta, and it forced them to step into its role fully as Greece's defender. 480 BC, King Xerxes of Persia led a massive army. Herodotus gives a pretty implausible figure of 2 million, but modern estimates still reckon perhaps about 100 to 150,000 troops. Pretty huge by Greek standards. He led them over the Hellespont and down into mainland Greece. The Greeks realized that only a unified defense could hope to stop this host. A congress of Greek city-states formed, and because of Sparta's military prestige and leadership of the Peloponnesian League, the allies agreed that Sparta would command the joint effort. The Spartan, Eurybiades, was given command of the navy, largely to appease Spartan pride, since Athens provided by far the largest fleet, and King Leonidas I of Sparta was appointed to lead the land forces. However, Spartan religiosity again caused a delay. When the news came that Xerxes' army was approaching, it was late summer, coinciding with both the Carnea festival in Sparta and the Olympic Games, which all Greeks, by the way, including Spartans, honored by ceasing all warfare. Bound by custom, the bulk of the Spartan army could not march out right away. Leonidas thus took only his personal royal guard of 300 hand-picked Spartans, all with living sons to carry on their name, and a few thousand allies from other Peloponnesian cities, advancing north to Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass in central Greece, ideal for blocking the Persian advance. It was there, in August 480, that Leonidas and his small force encountered the vast Persian army in one of history's most celebrated battles. For 2 days, the Greeks at Thermopylae, perhaps 7,000 strong, held off wave after wave of Persian soldiers. The narrow defile nullified the Persians' numerical advantage, and the Greek hoplites, especially the Spartans in the forefront, showed superb discipline and bravery. Herodotus recounts with evident admiration how the Spartans combed their long hair calmly before the battle and fought with relentless valor. On the second day, a notorious act of treachery altered the situation. A local man, Ephialtes, revealed to Xerxes the existence of a small mountain path that bypassed Thermopylae. The Persians sent a force around behind the Greeks. Realizing this position was about to be encircled, Leonidas dismissed the bulk of the allied contingents, many of whom were eager to go, seeing the fighting as hopeless. He kept with him only his 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians who had volunteered to stay, along with a few hundred Theban troops. Now you see, the Thebans, they were said to have been held as hostages for good behavior, and many actually surrendered once the battle was joined. Leonidas' small band prepared to sell their lives dearly. Knowing death was certain, the Spartans fought with utter ferocity. When their spears broke, they fought with swords. When those failed, they used fists and teeth. Leonidas himself fell, and a victorious struggle raged over his body. The Spartans refused to let the Persians take the king's corpse, holding them off until they dragged his body away. Finally, overwhelmed by missile fire, the remaining Greeks were killed to the last man. The Persian victory at Thermopylae, though, came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Persians had been slain in those 3 days, and was won only through flanking the defenders. Xerxes was infuriated by the resistance, and he ordered Leonidas's head be impaled on a stake, an act that shocked Greek sensibilities. Kings were supposed to be treated with respect, even in death. But if Xerxes hoped to cow the Greeks, the effect was the complete opposite. The Spartan sacrifice became a rallying cry. One anecdote from Thermopylae illustrates the Spartans' dry wit and courage under fire. When the Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows were said to blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior, named Dianekes by the way, quipped, "So much the better, we shall fight in the shade." Now, this remark has echoed through history, an epitome of cool bravery. Moreover, an enigmatic oracle had foretold that Sparta would either lose a king or see the city destroyed. By his death, Leonidas was said to have fulfilled that prophecy, thus saving Sparta itself. When Leonidas was making his stand, the Greek navy, including a Spartan admiral and a contingent of Spartan ships, battled the Persian fleet at Artemisium. After Thermopylae fell, central Greece lay open to Xerxes. The Spartans, with most of their armies still in the Peloponnese, favored withdrawing to the Isthmus of Corinth to fortify a final defensive line. This caused a crisis with the Athenians. Their city lay directly in the Persian path, and in September 480, Athens was indeed captured and burned by Xerxes. The Athenians had evacuated, though, to the island of Salamis and other safe havens, so when the Persians got there, they didn't have much resistance. It was at this moment of peril that Themistocles of Athens convinced the wavering Greek allies to make a stand with the navy. In the Battle of Salamis of 480, the Greek fleet lured the larger Persian navy into the narrow waters around Salamis, and they won a resounding victory, largely thanks to Athenian skill, though a Spartan, Eurybiades, was technically the overall commander. Xerxes was alarmed, to say the least. He saw his fleet ruined, and he feared being trapped in Europe. He fled back to Asia with part of his army, leaving a large force under his general Mardonius to continue the conquest of Greece next year. In summer of 479, Sparta took a more central role again. Under the regent Pausanias, a nephew of Leonidas, as Leonidas' son Pleistarchus was still a child. The full Spartan field army marched north. They joined other Greek contingents in the largest hoplite army yet seen, tens of thousands strong, and met Mardonius's Persians in Boeotia. The resulting Battle of Plataea was, in effect, Spartans' revenge for Thermopylae. On the plains near Plataea, the Spartans, Tegeans, Athenians, and others fought with a chaotic but decisive battle. Herodotus devotes a lengthy narrative to Plataea, praising the valor of the Spartans in particular. When the Persians broke through part of the Greek lines, the Spartan hoplites faced the elite Persian guard troops. The Persians lacked heavy armor and proper spears to confront the Greek phalanxes head-on. Despite their courage and showers of arrows, they could not withstand the Spartan onslaught. Pausanias, commanding the Lacedaemonians, kept his men disciplined, even under a hail of missiles, until the sacrifices indicated the gods' favor. And then the Spartans advanced. In hand-to-hand combat they drove the Persians back, and eventually stormed the Persian camp, utterly routing the enemy. As for Mardonius, he was killed. Legend has it that a Spartan warrior named Arimnestus crushed his skull with a stone. The victory at Plataea was comprehensive, effectively destroying the Persian army in Greece. On the same day, the Greek fleet won another battle at Mycale in Ionia, where Spartan king Leotychades led the Greeks in destroying the remnants of Xerxes' navy. These twin victories ended the Persian invasion for good. In the Greek collective memory, Sparta's contributions loomed large. A Spartan had led at Thermopylae heroically, and at Plataea successfully. When the spoil of Plataea was eventually divided, the prize for the best valor was given to the Spartans. Pausanias, in particular, basked in glory. He dedicated a gold tripod at Delphi with an inscription crediting himself as commander-in-chief of the Hellenes, an act viewed by some as a little bit vainglorious. And so, with Persia's immediate threat gone, Sparta's position was at a pretty high point. Sparta had been, I suppose, de facto supreme commander of the Greek forces in the greatest war that they had ever known. It's no wonder that later generations regarded Sparta, Athenians included, by the way, as the savior of Hellas in the Persian wars. Hellas is what the Greeks called their country, by the way. Anyway, that very success, it laid the groundwork for some new tensions. In the war's aftermath, the alliance between Sparta and Athens began to fray at the edges. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, tarnished his reputation by allegedly adopting Persian customs and even entertaining treasonous correspondence with Xerxes. Herodotus and Thucydides recount that Pausanias grew haughty, wore Persian dress, and was suspected of plotting to seize power with Persian help. So, they recalled Pausanias to face these charges. Though he was not immediately executed, his behavior alarmed the Greek allies. Moreover, Sparta showed little interest in liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor permanently, an objective that was very dear to Athens and the other Greek city-states. In 478, when the allied Greek fleet sailed to free the Aegean islands and Ionia, Sparta was still nominally in command. But the Spartan leadership alienated the naval allies. The proud and burgeoning naval power Athens eagerly stepped forward to lead, and thus, forming the Delian League of Ionia and the Islands in 477. Sparta acquiesced in this, perhaps even deliberately withdrawing. Some sources suggest Spartan air forces were wary of distant campaigns, and of their generals being corrupted by luxury abroad. This decision was critical. It essentially split the Greek world into two spheres, with Sparta preeminent on land and Athens preeminent on sea. For a generation after the Persian Wars, open conflict between Sparta and Athens was avoided, but the two powers grew ever more wary of each other. This period, 479 to 431, is sometimes called the Pentacontaetia, the 50 years, and was marked by a Cold War-like rivalry punctuated by occasional clashes and shifting alliances. Sparta had to confront troubles at home, too. In 464, a devastating earthquake hit Laconia, destroying Sparta and killing many citizens. The catastrophe immediately sparked a massive Helot revolt, as the Helots saw Spartan losses and chaos as an opportunity. One can hardly blame them. While the revolting Helots, especially the Messenian ones, fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, the Spartan army, now under King Archidamus II, struggled to dislodge them. In embarrassment, Sparta even called on allies for help, including Athens. The Athenians, led by Cimon, sent hoplites to assist their old comrades. But in a rather notorious incident, the Spartans abruptly dismissed the Athenian contingent, ostensibly fearing that radical democratic Athens might sympathize with the Helots, or simply not trusting their motivations. This was understandably quite an insult, and it led to a breach. The Athens broke off its alliance with Sparta, and in fact soon allied with Argos, Sparta's old enemy, if you remember. Thus, by the mid-5th century, the lines were drawn. An Athenian empire had formed. The Delian League evolved into an Athenian-dominated empire, and a Spartan-led Peloponnesian League stood as a counterweight. Minor wars flared, except for the First Peloponnesian War, 460 to 445, which saw Athens supporting Argos and fighting Sparta's allies, while Sparta raided rebellions against Athens. And eventually, a truce known as the 30 Years' Peace was signed in 445 between Sparta and Athens, aiming to freeze the status quo. But it only lasted about 15 years, before a far more serious confrontation erupted. So here we are, the Peloponnesian War, the great conflict that pitted Greek against Greek. Essentially, an ideological and power struggle between the Athenian Democratic Naval Empire and the Spartan oligarchic military coalition. Thucydides famously identified the root cause, the growth of power of Athens, and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon made the war inevitable. As Athens expanded its empire and influence, Sparta grew nervous. Its own position was threatened, and that the, quote, freedom of the Greeks was in jeopardy. This is interesting when they say the freedom of the Greeks. What they mean is the freedoms of the Spartans, not the freedoms of the Helots. They're Greeks too, right? Immediate triggers involve disputes over smaller states, Potidea, Corcyra, Megara, etc. But these were sparks in a powder keg of underlying rivalry. In 431, war was declared. The Spartan strategy under King Archidamus II was to invade Attica, the territory of Athens, with a superior Peloponnesian army, ravage the countryside, and provoke Athens into open hoplite battle. That's where the Spartans would shine and would crush them. The Athenians, however, under Pericles' guidance, refused to meet the Spartan phalanx in the field. Instead, they retreated behind Athens' long walls and relied on their navy to supply the city and harass Spartan allies by the sea. It all led to a war of attrition. Year after year, Spartan forces marched into Attica, burned crops, villagers, and then withdrew when their supplies ran low, while the Athenian navy, of course, raided coasts off the Peloponnese. The Spartans had no effective answer to the Athenian sea power. They lacked a strong fleet themselves, at least at first. The Athenians, in turn, could not break Sparta's grip on the mainland. A grim stalemate, punctuated by tragedies. In 430 BC, a devastating plague struck the crowded city of Athens, killing perhaps a quarter of its population, and even Pericles himself. Sparta was untouched by the plague. Their troops wisely stayed out of the disease-ridden environs of Athens that year, but the war dragged on without decisive result. Now, just quickly, I keep getting flashbacks of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I must admit, I went through that game. And yeah, it's not a historical study, I know, but I do advise, if you've not had the pleasure of playing it, you can go and do it if you are inclined to those sorts of leisure activities. It has my recommendation. Anyway, back to the video. Despite their hegemonic status, the Spartans were not invincible in this conflict. Notably, in 425, the Athenians achieved a stroke of luck mixed with boldness. At Pylos, in Messenia, Athenian forces under Demosthenes and Cleon managed to trap a group of Spartan hoplites on the island of Sphacteria. After weeks of siege and skirmish, the starving Spartans, 120 of them full citizens, surrendered. That's right. Spartans actually surrendered. Shock, I know. Well, the news certainly shocked all of Greece. Previously, it was believed that Spartans would fight to the death rather than give up. But even the Spartans themselves were stunned. In Sparta, anxious relatives demanded to know not if their men had died, but where they had died, assuming that no Spartan would surrender, only to learn that they were alive and well and kept as prisoners. Thucydides even wryly comments that the Spartans' excuse was that the men had surrendered only when it was impossible to resist any longer. Yeah, it doesn't sound as good, doesn't it? Rather, an excuse that was met by quite a good amount of scorn. Athens paraded these Spartan captives as trophies and held them hostage against future Spartan good behavior in Messenia. And indeed, for a while, Sparta desisted from invading, at least in Attica, under threat the hostages would be executed, which is also another strange thing, because you would think that if they had surrendered, the Spartans would see them as traitors to the Spartan cause and simply tell the Athenians, you may as well just execute them. They're no Spartans we know of. But apparently, no. Interesting. But still, through all this, despite the embarrassment, Sparta persevered, under the leadership of the steady Archidamus, and later his more, let's say, impulsive son, Agis II. They kept pressure on Athens and found ways to counter the Athenian advantage. One strategy was to foment rebellions among Athens' allies, something that Spartan diplomacy worked at continuously. Another was to exploit Athenian frailties. Give you an example. The Athenians' hubris led them in 415 BC to launch a massive expedition to Sicily, seeking to conquer Syracuse. The Sicilian expedition ended in complete disaster by 413. The Athenian army and fleet wiped out. Time for a party in Sparta. They rejoiced and seized the moment. At the urging of a renegade Athenian, Alcibiades, you might have heard that name, King Agis established a permanent Spartan fort at Decelea in Attica, cutting off Athens from its supply routes and forcing the Athenians into even greater distress. Most crucially, Sparta at last decided to build a real navy. And guess who financed it? It was the Persians. Can you believe that? Now, isn't that a twist in the story? Let no one say that history is boring. Pretty ironic turn, don't you think? The Persians, erstwhile enemies, they saw a chance to get back at Athens, which had been supporting Persian rebellious Greeks. Remember those old revolts? Yeah. Persian satraps in Asia Minor provided gold to Sparta to construct fleets and hire rowers. Spartan leadership in this naval war fell increasingly to one man, Lysander, an ambitious and capable navarch, or admiral in the modern tongue, who had a knack for gaining Persian support, even befriended the Persian prince Cyrus. So from 411 onward, the war shifted to the Aegean and the Hellespont, with naval battles deciding the fate of the Athenians. Sparta experienced setbacks. Their fleet was defeated by Athenians at Cynossema and Cyzicus in 410, but they kept rebuilding with Persian aid. Bit of a learning curve for the naval battles, I suppose. But there's no way that the Athenians would be putting their hand up to face them on land. Death sentence against the Spartans, that's for sure. In 407, Lysander took command and forged an alliance with Cyrus, ensuring generous funding. In 405, Lysander struck decisively. He surprised the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami at the Hellespont, capturing nearly all their ships in a sudden attack. The catastrophic loss cut off Athens' grain lifeline from the Black Sea. And with that, Athens was doomed. In 404, starved and surrounded, Athens finally surrendered. The Spartans, urged by Corinth and the Thebes to destroy Athens utterly, chose a more moderate path, perhaps out of respect for Athens' past role against Persia, or guided by King Pausanias or some ephors who argued for leniency. Athens' long walls were torn down, all to the sound of celebrating Spartan flutes. Its fleet was reduced to a token, its empire dismantled, but the city itself was spared. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War, and it was now the undisputed dominant power in the Greek world. In victory, the Spartans portrayed themselves as liberators of Greece, which is quite ironic since they were funded by the Persians. Well, we can't harp on too much about that. You wouldn't say it to their face, I suppose. They had ostensibly fought to free the Greek cities from Athenian oppression. Indeed, one could argue that Sparta achieved what it claimed. The Athenian Empire was no more, and many cities were, quote, liberated from paying tribute to Athens. But, and I'm sure you saw this coming, it soon became pretty clear that this Spartan liberation could be heavy-handed in its own way. Sparta demanded that its former allies, and even erstwhile neutrals, accept Spartan-friendly oligarchic governments. In Athens, they installed the notorious 30 Tyrants, an oligarchy that, with Spartan backing, carried out bloody purges of democratic partisans in 404 to 403. Elsewhere, Sparta sent out hormosts, that is, military governors, and supported local oligarchic factions, often composed of the city's aristocrats, who would be loyal to Spartan interests. Decades of war had hardened Sparta's outlook. Now they sought to ensure permanent hegemony. Sparta even took over the leadership once held by Athens in the Aegean. By the Peace of 404, the Spartans assumed control of Ionia, the Greek cities in Asia Minor, which was a tacit betrayal of those cities. Why? Because they soon ceded them back to Persia in exchange for Persian support in the King's Peace Agreement of 387. Some liberators, many Greeks, understandably grew quite disillusioned with this hypocrisy. The liberators had just become whip-yielding masters. And the Spartan king, Agesilaus II, reportedly quipped, quote, Sparta had not been ruined by the Persians, but we have ruined ourselves by our success. Nonetheless, in the immediate aftermath of the war, Spartan prestige was immense, and that couldn't be denied. The city of Lycurgus stood at the pinnacle of influence, Spartan commanders and governors were active from the coasts of Turkey to the far west. Even in the Olympic Games, a peacetime arena of honor, Spartans like the Prince Agesilaus and the General Lysander were celebrated figures. Sparta's conservative society, so long insulated, began to encounter riches and temptations abroad. After 400, we hear of some Spartans accumulating wealth. Lysander allegedly brought home piles of gold and silver, which had been a forbidden metal in Sparta. Social strains also appeared. Aristotle later observed that the Spartan victory in the Great War brought a, quote, deceptive success, that the Spartan state was ill-equipped to manage an empire, or let alone handle luxury. We can paraphrase Aristotle's critique. They had been trained for war, but when peace came, they fell victim to excess and love of money. Well, isn't that a tale as old as time? So much against that Spartan ethos. And this would soon become evident as new enemies and old flaws beset the Spartan hegemony. So here we stand, at the top of the mountain. The only way to go is down. So, Sparta's supremacy after 404 proved to be short-lived. In the span of a few decades, the rigid Spartan system began to buckle under external pressures and internal weakness. The very factors that had made Sparta strong, unquestioning martial society, small elite corps of citizen soldiers, the exploitation of the helots, they now became liabilities in a changing Greek world. Two main challenges defined Sparta's decline: the rise of Thebes, briefly in the 370s, and the ascent of Macedon under Philip II in the 350s to 30s. Both of these powers dealt severe blows to Spartan influence. Meanwhile, internal issues like population decline and economic inequality were all eating away at Sparta's foundation. By the mid-4th century, observers could see that the once mighty Sparta had fallen from her high estate, as Aristotle put it. So, let's begin the journey down. In the immediate post-war years of 400s BC, Sparta's hegemony was challenged by discontent among its own allies and resentment of former neutral fence-sitters. In 399, the Spartans recalled the exiled king Agesilaus II, brother of the ill-fated Agis II, to become their Aegean king. Agesilaus, though lame in one leg, was a fiery leader and a staunch champion of traditional Spartan ways. He soon embarked on an ambitious venture, leading a Spartan expedition to Asia Minor to free the Greek cities from Persian rule, perhaps to carve out new wealth for Sparta. Well, in 396 to 394, Agesilaus campaigned successfully in Anatolia, winning skirmishes and challenging the Persian satraps. But the Persians responded with diplomatic guile. They funded Sparta's Greek enemies to stir up trouble back in Greece, and up it was stirred. Sure enough, a coalition formed in 395 that included Sparta's old allies, now turned foes, notably Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos. That's right, look who's back. This Corinthian war, 395 to 387, pulled Agesilaus back from Asia to defend the homeland. Although Sparta won some land battles, the Spartan navy was destroyed by a Persian-backed Athenian fleet in 394, undoing Spartan naval power. The war dragged on until, ironically, the Persians stepped in and dictated a peace. We've mentioned it. The King's Peace of 387, also called the Peace of Antalcidas, after the Spartan diplomat. It declared that all Greek cities in Asia were Persians, and that all other Greek cities were to be autonomous. Well, what did that mean in practice? Well, in practice it meant that Sparta was recognized as the enforcer of peace. The Persian king, Artaxerxes, essentially gave Sparta license to dominate the mainland, so long as Sparta conceded Ionia to Persia. This was a cynical deal. Sparta sacrificed the Ionian Greeks it had once sworn to protect, but it temporarily shored up Spartan hegemony. Sparta used the king's peace to justify harsh actions. The clause mandating autonomy was invoked to break up any coalition or city that Sparta disliked, and there were plenty of them. For example, Sparta disbanded the Boeotian League, an alliance led by Thebes, and the Chalcidice League, led by Olynthus, on grounds that these federations violated the autonomy of smaller cities. In 382, in a particularly egregious move, a Spartan commander named Phoebidas, passing through Boeotia, treacherously seized the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, during the time of peace. Sparta installed a puppet oligarchy in Thebes and garrisoned the Cadmea with Spartan troops. A brazen act, that's for sure, and one not officially authorized by Sparta's government, but ultimately it was condoned. But that didn't mean it wasn't a grave misstep. It outraged Greek opinion and sowed the seeds for Sparta's nemesis, Theban resentment. In 379, a band of Theban patriots, led by Pelopidas, with the Athenian covert support, staged a daring coup in Thebes. They assassinated the Spartan-backed oligarchs and liberated the city. The Spartan garrison was compelled to surrender to the Cadmea. Thebes was free again. Whoop-de-doo. And now it was bent on revenge and asserting its own power. Thus began the Spartan-Theban conflict of the 370s. Jesus, just one after the other, isn't it? It just never ends. Well, the brilliant Theban general, Epaminondas, emerged as a leader of Thebes' new democracy. He reformed Thebes' army, drilling a formidable Theban sacred band, 150 pairs of elite hoplites, and innovating in tactics. Thebes also rebuilt the Boeotian League, rallying the towns of Boeotia under its leadership. Sparta, meanwhile, was facing the limits of its manpower. The Spartan citizen body, once perhaps 8,000 strong in 480, had dwindled drastically. Continuous war, casualties, and the strict inheritance laws meant fewer Spartiates to line up in the phalanx. Now, those inheritance laws, by the way, often led to estates consolidating and many citizens losing status. Yeah, not a very good situation. By the 370s, Sparta could field only a fraction of the hoplites it once did. Moreover, many of those hoplites were not full Spartiates, but perioikoi, or even freed helots. Something, of course, was unimaginable back in the glory days. Several generations before, they wouldn't even thought of something like this. And so the Spartans' army core was thinner. Still tough, still superbly trained, but definitely smaller. In 371, Sparta faced Thebes on the battlefield at Leuctra in Boeotia. King Cleombrotus I led the Spartan army, which included about 700 Spartiate peers and perhaps 1,300 perioikoi and allies, plus cavalry, around 10,000 in total according to rough estimate. As for the Thebans, they had about 6,000 to 7,000. Outnumbered. Not hugely, but slightly. Yet, Leuctra would go down in history, not as another Spartan victory, but as the battle that shattered the image of Spartan invincibility. Employing novel tactics, massing his hoplites 50 ranks deep on one flank and advancing in an oblique line, Epaminondas struck the Spartan right wing, where Cleombrotus and the Spartans stood with overwhelming force. The Spartan line could not withstand the weight of the charge. Cleombrotus was mortally wounded. The Spartan elite cut to pieces. An estimated 400 Spartiates fell, including many of the equal-ranking homioi. The remaining Spartans lost heart and fled, something unheard of before. Just imagine the sight. Well, for the first time in memory, the Spartan army had been decisively defeated in a pitched hoplite battle by another Greek force. The psychological impact was enormous. In one stroke, Thebes had destroyed the myth of Spartan supremacy. As Xenophon describes in his Hellenica, when the news of the defeat reached the Peloponnese, the reaction was disbelief and dread. Spartan power, a lot of it was based on reputation. And now, that spell was completely broken. Maybe this was the point where Sparta ended. I don't know. At least in a certain sense, perhaps Sparta died on the battlefield that day at Leuctra. Well, it always continues, I suppose. Some sense. I suppose we arrive to zombie Sparta now. The consequences of Leuctra, they were dire. The Thebans and their allies, seizing the initiative, invaded Laconia itself in the following year. In 370, for the first time in recorded history, the enemy troops entered Spartan heartland and marched toward the unwalled city of Sparta. Epaminondas led the expedition personally. The small Spartan army that remained under the aging King Agesilaus stayed on the defensive, fortifying key positions and refusing open battle. Epaminondas advanced to the Eurotas Valley, a sight unseen since the Dorian invasion, if ever, and they overran much of Laconia. Spartan women and children could only watch from the city heights as enemy fires burned in their fertile plain. Yet Epaminondas did not assault the city of Sparta itself, perhaps judging it too risky to attack desperate Spartans in an urban fight, or perhaps not wishing to annihilate them. Perhaps it was a lingering respect. Who knows? Instead, he implemented a masterstroke of strategic reordering. He freed Messania. Gathering Helot deserters and exiles, Epaminondas formally liberated the region that had been under Sparta's yoke for some 300 years. Now that is a liberation. On the slopes of Mount Ithome, the same defensive bastion Helots once held in revolts, Epaminondas founded a new city, Messane, in 369 BCE. Fortified with thick walls and attracting former Helots from near and far, Messane became the new capital of an independent Messania. This was an almost fatal blow to Spartan's power. Messenia's rich lands were the economic backbone of Sparta, worked by Helots to feed and fund the Spartan state. And now Sparta irretrievably lost those lands and the labor force. The number of Helots still under Spartan control, in Laconia only, was drastically reduced, and Spartan wealth and manpower declined proportionately. The liberation of Messania was the most dramatic outcome of Sparta's defeat. But it was not the only one. Epaminondas also helped reorganize the political map of the Peloponnese to hem Sparta in. In Arcadia, just north of Sparta, he supported the foundation of a new federal city, Megalopolis. Creative name, I suppose, just means big city. He fostered leagues among the smaller states that had once been under Spartan sway. Essentially, Thebes tried to create a counterweight to Sparta's Peloponnesian League, and Sparta now stood isolated, completely, largely reduced to its original Lycurgan territory, minus their slaves in Messania. The once dreaded Spartan hoplites, they could no longer cower the Greeks automatically. In fact, many formerly subject peoples like the Arcadians took some revenge, raiding Laconia and harassing the Spartans in the subsequent years. You know what they say about payback, right? It's kinda hard to feel sorry for them. Sure, they might have stopped the Persians at Thermopylae, but then they invited the Persians in to fund their navies, to fight other Greeks, all for a bit of greed. And then it's hard to not congratulate all of those slaves being freed. The Spartans aren't exactly what they're presented as once you actually start looking into it. But Sparta did not collapse immediately after Leuctra. Agesilaus and later Archidamus III, that being Agesilaus' son, kept a semblance of their state intact. More of a shadow of the former glory, really. The Spartans even found a curious kind of pride in endurance. An anecdote from this era illustrates the Spartan stoicism. When a Spartan mother heard that her son had been killed in battle, she reportedly responded, "I bore him so that he might die for Sparta, and I am content." Rather cold comfort. Another story relates that after Leuctra, the relatives of the fallen grieved quietly, while those whose sons survived hung their heads in shame, since survival was equated with possible cowardice. Plutarch claims that Sparta's women folk, far from wailing, were stoic, or even glad to have their men prove their valor in death. Though you might suspect that this is an idealized picture, the Spartan mother trope. It glosses over the real trauma that those Spartans must have experienced. Just remember, too, everyone, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, is just a human being. And what gets written down in books hundreds of years later, in tales and all the rest, well, a lot of those little embellishments are just a part of the story. No mother, no father, no matter what societal conditioning, is not going to weep when they have to bury their dead child. Anyway, let's not harp on about that. And so, for the next decade, 370s to 360s, Thebes was the preeminent power in Greece. And Sparta, little Sparta over there in the corner, was just a secondary player. Now, do remember that Spartan forces did fight alongside Athens and others against Thebes in the Battle of Mantinea in 362, which was a large-scale clash ending in the death of Epaminondas. A pretty heroic and typically Greek end. Somewhat poetic, don't you think? The battle was tactically indecisive. Epaminondas won the field, but he lost his life, and that left Thebes without a leader. With his death, Theban dominance waned. Everything has to rise and fall. However, Sparta, they were in no position to reassert control. In different circumstances, they could probably fill in the power vacuum left behind. But in fact Sparta refused to sign the peace treaties that followed Mantinea because they would not acknowledge Messenia's independence. They were still holding on to those old ways. Now it was famous for its stubbornness, and this left Sparta diplomatically isolated. Surely when quills were put to paper, or chisels put to stones, whatever the saying is for back then, there must have been plenty of eye rolls when Sparta was still trying to assert itself as the power it once was, not wanting to let go of their helot slave class. Well, King Agesilaus, who had been serving heroically since before Leuctra, he was now an old man, and no one was really taking him seriously anymore. He actually took a mercenary command in Egypt in his final years to raise money for Sparta. That's right, he took up a part-time job. Now, if that doesn't show you how far things had fallen, a Spartan king fighting for a few coins abroad, then I don't know what will. By the mid-4th century, the 350s, Sparta's citizen population had dwindled alarmingly. Aristotle, writing around this time actually of 350, observed that where once Sparta had 10,000 citizens, likely an inflated memory, now barely 1,000 of them remained. And of those, perhaps only 100 of them had land, meaning that wealth and property had become concentrated. In another source, possibly from later records or Plutarch's time, is noted that by the time King Agis IV attempted reforms, this is around 244, only 700 Spartan families of pure citizen status were left, and of those merely 100 as well owned substantial wealth. This oliganthropia, shortage of men, had critical military implications. There was no way Sparta could field the large disciplined phalanx of earlier days. They increasingly relied on allied or mercenary contingents. The remaining Spartans also, by many accounts, had drifted from the austere Lycurgan discipline. Luxury items and private wealth had seeped in after the Peloponnesian War via exposure to Persia and other riches. But in all honesty, what was there really left to fight for? You may as well just enjoy your life at this point. So it was in this weakened context that a new superpower emerged to eclipse all the Greek city-states. Macedon, under King Philip II. In the 360s, Macedon was a rising kingdom in the north, considered semi-barbarian by southerners, but rapidly adopting Greek military techniques. Philip II, who took the throne in 359, built a professional army. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long Sarissa spears, and began intervening in Greek affairs. Athens, Thebes, and smaller states were drawn into conflicts with Macedon in the 350s and 40s, and Sparta, notably, mostly stood aloof from these struggles. Philip carefully avoided provoking Sparta directly. There is a famous exchange wherein Philip, after overrunning much of Greece, sent Sparta a warning. That warning was as follows: "If I enter Laconia, I will level Sparta to the ground." The Spartan ephor's reply was a single word: "If." Well, whether apocryphal or not, this laconic defiance reflected the Spartan pride, still stirring those embers of the old ways. In truth, Philip never did invade Sparta, probably because the rough terrain of Laconia and the Spartan reputation for brutal resistance simply made it not worth the effort. Perhaps it was simply because he had a larger fish to fry, Thebes or Athens. Either way, after Philip's decisive victory over a Theban Athenian army at Chaeronea in 338, he established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states under Macedonian hegemony. But notably, Sparta was left out. Philip reputedly allowed Sparta to remain independent, but stripped away some of its remaining peripheral territories. According to one account, Philip sent a message to Sparta asking if he should come as a friend or a foe. The Spartans replied, neither. In the end, Philip just left them alone. A proud but powerless anachronism. Under Philip's son, however, Alexander the Great, you might have heard of him. By the way, he's called Alexander the Accursed in Persian circles, by the way, for obvious reasons. Well, Sparta's irrelevance was further highlighted when he came along. Almost all Greek states submitted to Alexander's leadership when he set out to conquer Persia. Sparta, pointedly, did not. They refused to join the League of Corinth. In Alexander's absence, while he was in Asia, the Spartan king, Agis III, did attempt one last grasp at restoring Spartan glory, in 331, with some Persian gold and a coalition of discontented Peloponnesian allies. Agis III raised a revolt against Macedonian rule. He fought a pitched battle against a Macedonian army, led by Alexander's regent Antipater near Megalopolis. The Spartans, outnumbered, were defeated, and Agis III was killed in combat after reportedly fighting with great bravery. He allegedly told Antipater as he lay dying, "There is no cause to pity me. I was born to die for Sparta." Nice last words. Well, this defeat in 331 effectively ended Sparta's ability to challenge the new order. Alexander, however, dealt leniently. He did not sack Sparta, but simply made them join the League of Corinth afterwards and imposed a fine. Sparta's days as an independent, hegemonic power were well and truly over. Now they were just a minor player, albeit famous for their past, living in a shadow of their former glory. Now that's sad. In the early Hellenistic period, that's the late 4th, 3rd centuries, Sparta's fortunes sunk to their lowest ebb, but then they saw a brief attempt at revivals. Alexander had died in 323, and his successors carved up the empire. Sparta mostly kept to itself during the wars of the Diadochi, neither gaining nor losing much. The Spartan kings, now of diminished importance, occasionally aligned with or against neighboring Greek leagues, like the Achaean or Aetolian leagues, or Macedonian monarchs as it suited them. The dual kingship, it continued on, but the old structures were hollow. Many Spartiates had lost their citizenship for failing to contribute to Syssitia, because of course they lost their land, so how could they? The agōgē, that famous training system, perhaps faltered due to fewer boys and less state wealth to support it. Inequality was stark. A few families, the so-called dinatoi, owned large estates and helots, while many once proud Spartans were impoverished. The situation led to the rise of reformist kings in the 3rd centuries who tried to restore Lycurgan equality. The first of these was Agis IV, who became king in 244. Appalled at the decline of Sparta, only 700 true citizens remained by his count, and of them only a few of them were doing anything worthwhile. So Agis proposed a drastic reform. He wanted to cancel debts and redistribute land, to create 4,500 new citizen holdings. including restoring citizenship to the sons of lost Spartans, and even including some agōgē. He even planned to broaden the agōgē enrollment and see these new citizens rejuvenating the army. Agis was earnest. Plutarch paints him as idealistic and uncorrupted, likening him to the Gracchi in Rome, and initially he gained popular support, even winning over one of the two kings. Himself and Leonidas II were reigning. He managed to have Leonidas deposed for a time, and he had the backing of his wealthy mother and grandmother, who offered to contribute their vast estates to the common pool, indicating the extent of female property control as well, as we've discussed. However, Agis' reforms threatened the entrenched elite, including many in the Gerousia. After some political maneuvering, the conservative faction rallied. When Agis' main ally was out of office, the ephorate changed. The opposition had Leonidas II restored. In 241, Agis IV was arrested, and in a shocking break with Spartan precedent, executed alongside his mother. And that is the first time that a Spartan king had been judicially killed in Sparta. They just keep breaking from tradition, don't they? The reactionary forces thought they had quashed the egalitarian movement, but the economic and social pressures did not go away. A few years later, Cleomenes III, the son of Leonidas II, took up the cause, but from a different angle. Cleomenes became Archaic king in 235 and proved to be a dynamic and ruthless leader. Inspired, according to Plutarch, by Stoic philosophy and the memory of Lycurgus, Cleomenes aimed to remake Spartan society to its old standard, and also to restore Sparta's military power in Greece. Around 227, Cleomenes launched a coup. He had 4 of the 5 ephors assassinated, a shocking act, as ephors were sacrosanct in the old system, and he forced many wealthy opponents into exile or execution. He then carried out a sweeping Cleomenian reform, cancelling all debts, redistributing land into 4,000 lots for citizens. Some sources say he even made 4,000 new citizens, including agōgē and foreigners, willing to fight for Sparta, and reviving the agōgē in strict communal discipline. He reportedly cut the 2 remaining Spartan luxury items. He forbade the use of couches and costly furniture, and made all Spartan men again eat the black broth and sleep in barracks. Cleomenes even abolished the traditional dual kingship, leaving himself as the sole king. For the Eurypontid king had been disposed or killed. In effect, he refounded Sparta, starting again from the ground up, sweeping away both oligarchic abuses and some constitutional niceties in favor of a military retro-revolution. The result? A Spartan resurgence, but pretty brief. Cleomenes raised a newly invigorated Spartan army and won a string of victories against the Achaean League, a rising federation in the northern Peloponnese that had been expanding its influence. The Achaeans, led by Aratus of Sicyon, were caught off guard by Sparta's renewal. I mean, no one really expected them to actually come back. But Cleomenes defeated them in multiple battles too, at Mount Lycaeum and Laodicea in 227, and also a major victory at Dyme. He even occupied Corinth and Argos, threatening to dominate the Peloponnese, just like the good old days. It seemed that Sparta might reclaim leadership. Notably, citizens exiled from other cities began showing interest in Cleomenes' program. It had a kind of populist appeal. I mean, cancellation of debts. I'm sure that certainly had a few people wanting to join up, but it also empowered the lower classes in areas he controlled. But ultimately, Cleomenes flew a little bit too close to the sun. He overreached. The Achaean League made a fateful decision. They requested aid from Antigonus III Doson, the king of Macedon. Antigonus III marched south with a Macedonian army. In 222 BC, the forces of Cleomenes and Antigonus clashed at the Battle of Salacia on Sparta's northern frontier. Cleomenes arranged his Spartan troops, augmented by mercenaries and perioikoi on two hills, Ava and Olympus. Guarding the pass to Sparta, a fierce battle ensued. The Macedonian phalanx, aided by Achaean allies, managed to break through the Spartan line. Cleomenes' reform army fought bravely. One hill held out staunchly under Cleomenes' half-brother, Eucleidas, until he was slain. But the weight of numbers and superior Macedonian equipment ultimately prevailed. The Spartan defeat was total. Thousands of Spartan soldiers died. Virtually the entire citizen army. They were all in on this final gamble at glory, and they lost. Cleomenes fled to the coast, and he escaped by ship to Egypt, where he sought refuge with Ptolemy III, who had earlier supported him financially. Not long after, Cleomenes met a tragic end. When the next Egyptian king grew suspicious of him, he was placed under house arrest. Cleomenes attempted a failed coup in Alexandria, and when it didn't work out, well, he decided to take his own life in 219. And with that, the final serious hope of Spartan revival went to the grave. The aftermath of Salacia was grim for Sparta. Antigonus III marched into the city of Sparta, the first foreign invader in history to do so by force. But to his credit, he didn't sack or destroy the city. That being said, sacking Sparta, you probably weren't going to get much treasure from that anyway. He ended Cleomenes' revolution, restoring the old dual kingship with puppets friendly to Macedon, one of whom was Agesipolis III, a child from a royal house. He dismantled Sparta's newly built city fortifications. Cleomenes had actually fortified Sparta with walls, another break from tradition that prided itself on its men being its defenses. The Spartan territory was diminished and made subservient to Macedon and the Achaean League. So over the next decade, Sparta was effectively in a sorry state of turmoil. Sorrier than, well, they couldn't get much sorrier than before, but, well, they're proving us all wrong, aren't they? There was even a brief tyranny, too, a certain Nabis, who claimed distant kinship to the royal line. He seized power in 207, and he even declared himself ruler, alternatively styling himself king and tyrant at the same time. So let's talk about Nabis, because he was in a way the last gasp of an independent Sparta. I know they've had a few last gasps, but this one's a bit unique. He actually took Cleomenes' social revolution to a bit of an extreme, reigning from 207 to 192 BCE, by the way. Now, Polybius, who had also detested Nabis, paints him as a lawless brigand. Quote, Nabis, tyrant of Sparta, destroyed the last remains of the old Spartan nobles, drove them into banishment, all men eminent for wealth or family, and distributed their property and wives among his own followers. Not a good review there from Polybius. But indeed, Nabis embraced a radical program of wealth redistribution, which is another word for stealing people's money. He confiscated lands and assets from the remaining wealthy and gave them to his mercenaries and supporters, many of whom were not native Spartans but freed helots, criminals, and adventurers attracted by the promise of gain. He reportedly armed many helots, and even recruited hardened men from all over Greece to form his mercenary corps. To fund his regime, Nabis engaged in piracy. Sparta acquired a small fleet, and also a little bit of extortion on the side. There is one lurid story, perhaps exaggerated by the hostility of the sources. It describes the apega, a mechanical automaton of Nabis's wife that he would use to literally squeeze money out of unwilling wealthy women. The device was a kind of iron maiden that would embrace and mutilate the victim until they paid up. Under Nabis, Sparta became something akin to a rogue state, at war with its neighbors and traditional norms. But Nabis did partially realize the dream of widening Spartan citizenship. He formally freed many helots and made them citizens. Some historians see him as an early experiment in social revolution, though ancient writers uniformly cast him as a depraved and terrible tyrant. He also fortified Sparta once more, and he even managed to mint Spartan coins. Now do remember that they traditionally never had them. No Spartan king had ever done that before. Another break in tradition. Money had always been frowned upon. Nabis managed to hold on for 15 years, navigating between larger powers. At first, he allied with Macedon against the Achaean League and Rome, which by this time had begun intervening in Greece. After Macedon's defeat by Rome in the Second Macedonian War of 197, Nabis opportunistically seized the city of Argos, which at the time Philip V of Macedon had held. But this overreach drew the ire of Rome, and not to mention the rest of Greece too. And in 195, the Romans, under the consul Titus Quintius Flaminius and the Achaean League, declared war on Nabis to liberate Argos and Sparta from his tyranny. A Roman army besieged Sparta by land, and a Roman fleet blockaded it by sea. Nabis's Neo-Spartan army fought hard, and the city of Sparta withstood a Roman assault. But facing starvation and internal dissent, Nabis agreed to finally negotiate. Flaminius compelled him to surrender. Argos was given up, his navy was also dismantled, and he withdrew his garrisons outside Laconia. Now remarkably, Flaminius left Nabis in power in Sparta, perhaps to avoid creating a power vacuum. Rome had claimed to be freeing the Greeks, not annexing anything at this stage, and Flaminius famously proclaimed Greek freedom at the Isthmian Games. God, I hate that word. Isthmian, in 196 BC. But Sparta's days of true independence, no, they were numbered. Of course, the Romans are here. What are you going to do about it? So in 192, Nabis finally met his end, assassinated ironically by a group of Aetolians who had come ostensibly to help train his army, but actually just seized the chance to kill him. Didn't see that coming, didn't he? And so with Nabis's death, Sparta spiraled briefly into chaos. The old royal lineage was extinct or discredited. There was no clear succession. The Achaean League, a federation of city-states in the Peloponnese that by now included almost all of them except Sparta, decided to take the opportunity to absorb Sparta as well. By 192 to 188 BCE, under the leadership of Peloponnesian, the great Achaean general, the League forced Sparta's integration. Sparta was compelled to abolish the Lycurgan laws formally. The agōgē was ended. The exiled opponents of Nabis were allowed back, likely seeking revenge on those who had thrived under Nabis. The very character of Sparta was drastically altered. Plutarch recounts that Peloponnesian even forced Spartans to tear down the walls of their city and prohibited their traditional education in an attempt to make Sparta a normal city within the League. Many Spartan youths, raised under Nabis and earlier military systems, refused to accept these changes, and they were either killed or they fled. And so for the first time, perhaps since Lycurgus, Spartans began to travel abroad freely, or hire themselves out as mercenaries, now that their unique system was dismantled. And Sparta just became another provincial city, all exceptionalism curtailed. Of course, the situation lasted only a short time before an even greater power stepped in. In 146, the Romans crushed a revolt by the Achaean League, which unwisely went to war against Rome. And not a very good decision. Well, it's all in hindsight, I suppose. The Roman general Mummius destroyed Corinth in 146, marking the effective end of Greek political independence. The Romans dissolved the Achaean League and annexed Greece, organizing it later as the province of Achaia. Sparta, which had sided with Rome during that last war, was spared any destruction. In fact, Sparta under Roman rule saw something of a gentle revival, not of power, but more of status as a living museum of the old Greek virtue. Hey, they better take what they can get at this point, I suppose. Well, under the early empire, Sparta was allowed to have a measure of self-government as a free city. The Spartans, ever conscious of their heritage, leveraged this for tourism. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, visitors from across the Roman world came to see Spartan sights and spectacles. The geographer Strabo, writing in the time of Augustus, notes that by his day Sparta was sparsely populated, and a shadow of its former self, but still quite famous. People were coming from all over the place to see the old sites. So the traveller Pausanias, around 150 AD, gives a detailed account of the monuments in Sparta. He describes seeing the shrine of Lycurgus, the tomb of Leonidas, and the enduring practices, the ritual flogging of Spartan boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia, which had become a bit of a tourist attraction unto itself. During these ceremonies, youths were scourged until blood flowed, sometimes beaten to death to demonstrate the Spartan fortitude, while crowds of curious onlookers watched on. Plutarch, who visited Sparta personally, remarks that he had seen youth expiring under the lash at the altar of Artemis Orthia, and praised their endurance. The Romans, too, occasionally patronized the Spartans. The Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD toured Sparta, and likely contributed to building projects. Hadrian was Hellenic, and also revived some of the old Athenian glories. In Sparta, the theatre, originally built in the late Hellenistic period, was renovated. You can see its ruins today. It's one of the largest theatres in Greece. It seats up to 16,000 people. Roman period Sparta thus enjoyed a modest prosperity as a provincial town known for its glorious past. But despite this antiquarian interest, the reality was that Sparta's power was gone forever. the city never regained a meaningful military or political role. It continued to be inhabited through the Roman Empire and even late antiquity. Early Christian bishops of Sparta are attested, though Christianity was slow to take root in such a traditionally pagan locale. Finally, in CE 396, an invasion of Visigoths under Alaric ravaged many parts of Greece, and reportedly, Sparta was sacked and depopulated. The site of ancient Sparta fell into a declining ruin, and in the medieval period, a new town, Mistras, grew nearby, leaving Sparta itself as ruins and memory. Well, it's been over 2 hours now. We've certainly spoke a lot about Sparta, the Spartans, Lycurgus, Cleomenes, all of them, Agesilaus, Leonidas. So many great names. Perhaps you have some opinions of your own. Perhaps when you look at a kingdom keeping those poor helots under the boot, maybe you think good riddance at their destruction. Maybe you remember the deals struck with the Persians, throwing the rest of Greece and even Europe under the bus for their own means. Or maybe you remember the gradual descent into materialism that the later Spartans found themselves in, taking on those Persian attributes. The same situation that the Macedonians found themselves in when Alexander the Great found himself in those lands too, taking on their dress, their attitude, all the rest. Well, I think no matter what your opinions are on it, it's interesting. And, well, Sparta, we're talking about them still today. They still remain quite a cultural phenomenon. But when all's said and done, the capital of Greece, to this very day, is Athens. I wonder if those people in the Peloponnesian War could have imagined that almost 2,500 years later, that their old adversary would be the capital of the entire country. Interesting. Anyway, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Yeah, you didn't get a single ad, didn't you? That's pretty good. All because of the support. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Linda Reeves, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfid, Neo, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neurona, Darren, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Towery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Guka Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanito, and Claire. Top tier. Thank you so much. Our time together has finally come to an end. And I will see you in the next video. As always, lots of love to you all, and look after each other. Goodbye for now.